So do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess we'll just kick things off. Looks like we're live. I know we've got a number of folks virtual. Hopefully you can hear us here in the room. Perfect. Thanks, Jim, for the indication. We do not have any agenda items tonight, which is why we have a training in session. Feels like we just did one of these, but I guess we got to keep doing it. But Wilf is going to take us through some of the training from, I think, sexual harassment and ethics and things like that, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I'm actually going to do basics on planning.
I think that the other training will be in January.
Oh, good. I got someone I thought it was, so even better.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad I was corrected on that because this is going to be good for all of us. With that, looks like we've got everyone we're expecting. Justin, thanks for joining. And let's kick things off. So Wilf, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks. Gosh, when you said sexual harassment and all of that stuff, I thought, whoa.
I swear I saw
don't
that
know
in the
a whole lot
agenda
about
somewhere. I must be making it up.
All of that. First of all, I should ask, because with the microphone, can those who are online, can you hear me? Okay, if I've got the microphone down here. Looks like, yeah, thumbs up. All right, good. That'll help. Well, first of all, I haven't been to many of your meetings, so I've been doing stuff for you for a little bit, but that's all been a consequence of my dear wife, who's retired and loves to travel. And she already scheduled several things before I actually started working with Morgan City. So those are now done. So hopefully I'll be here for most of the rest of the meetings. I can't guarantee all of them though, because like I say, she loves to travel and she's always getting something going, but I'm glad to be here. I did come to one of your special meetings, which I got to meet some of you then, and look forward to doing some more stuff and being with you. I will tell you that, and this probably will make you all happy. I do need to end right about 7 o'clock, or as close as we can at 7, because I am on the Kaysville City Planning Commission, and they're meeting tonight as well. This isn't normally the night that they meet, but because of Veterans Day and Thanksgiving, they moved their meeting and they chose tonight, and we're doing a final recommendation from the Planning Commission on an update to the city's general plan tonight. So I've got to try and get down there and be part of that meeting and discussion down there. So it's just, it probably will break your hearts to know that we're just going to have to end the meeting at a set time and go away from that. And then you can all go home, but that's terrible, right? All right. Well, with that, what I am going to talk about tonight is some basics on land use. Talking to Teresa and to Ty and to some others. Some of you have apparently not been on the Planning Commission all that long. Others of you, it's never a bad thing to have a refresher course on some of this stuff. And what I found through my experience over the years is that people need this training all the time. It's just always a good idea. And of course, all the new people that are coming on, it's always helpful to have the things with regard to land use. So I have done these, we call it Land Use 101, which is kind of like the basics of land use. But I've had a little bit of a different presentation. I'm going to try something out on you all, because I had, working with the Utah Land Use Institute, we developed a presentation for the essentials of land use for realtors and developers. So it's kind of like the people on the other side of the table. And as I've used that, and as I've looked at it and talked to people about it, they said, that's a really good basics primer about how land use works. So I thought I'll try it from that perspective this time. And it's the same information. It's just maybe presented a little bit differently, but we'll give that a try and see how that works tonight. So that's why you see the title up there, rather than saying Land Use 101 or basic land use or whatever. It's saying the development and title through the land use process. So this is kind of targeted at that particular group. So with that, okay. Teresa, you got to help me how this thing. Do I need to aim this one? Did I do that? Yes, I did. All right, good. All right, so what we're going to talk about, of course, is what you all do, which is land use planning, land use regulation, and the process in the local communities for doing this thing that is probably one of the most important things that people do in local communities. When a lot of people run for office, and some of you have run for office, the interesting thing is when you ask people, why are you running to be elected to your city council or to be mayor? The two top answers that over the years that people have given, number one, taxes. Want to keep taxes low, want to make sure the tax money is spent wisely. Number two is land use, development, regulation of development in the community and planning. And so it's one of the top issues and why many people are involved in the land use process in local communities. Okay. Now see, I must be where I stand or how I.
Yeah, I think you have to point it.
Okay. Just basically, this is the planning process generally as it works throughout everywhere in the country. The first step is to develop a general plan for your community. Then you develop the ordinances that will implement your general plan. And then people go through the application process once you have your ordinances in place, and then they get eventually by complying with the ordinances that you have and going through that process, they get the permits and things get built in your community according to your plan and to the vision that you have for the community. That's pretty much how it seems to work. So it's also good to understand that this whole process that we use in our local communities is all basically outlined in the Utah State Code. There's a whole section there for cities and another section for counties. They're very similar, not exactly identical, but they're very similar. And it's called the Land Use Development and Management Act, or LUDMA, LUDMA. And that's something that sets out the process and the kinds of things we can and can't do in regulating land use in our local community. So we base everything we do on that, and then the legislature always seems to muck around in it and change it every year, does something with it. And so then we have to tell people what the new changes are and then try to get everybody in compliance with those. And that's a challenge. It's a bit of a process because it always seems like that there is a lot of input from both the local side, from the developer side, and even from the residents about things they don't like about the way the land use planning process works and regulation process. And so we seem to get a lot of changes, but those are all encapsulated here, and we'll go through a number of those provisions here so that you understand how those things work. All right, so land use is generally done at the local government level. You do have some things that happen maybe at a little bit higher level. We see some things now that are happening, like we have the Inland Port Authority. We have things like MIDA, the Military Installation Development Authority. There are some state level things that happen. But by and large, mostly the development process, it happens at the local community level. And so that's what we want to talk about tonight, because you are the officials in a local community for this land development process, or for the planning and land use process. So let's start how this works. Okay, first provision in the Utah State Code. If you want to regulate land use in your community, and most communities do, interestingly enough, not all of them do. We do have some small, very small communities in the state that have not enacted land use regulations, but most everybody has. If you want to do that, number one, state code says you have to have a planning commission. You must have a planning commission in order to do land use regulation. And so there you are. You're a mandated body under the state code. And there are a lot of provisions that go along with that, and we're going to talk about some of those. The Planning Commission's role, basically three things. The first one is to prepare and recommend a general plan for the community and any amendments to that general plan that may come up subsequently. And as I said, that's what I'm going down to Kaysville tonight for, is we're doing an update to the general plan for the city of Kaysville. And tonight, I think the Planning Commission is going to take the final action on recommending it on to the City Council. The second big thing is to prepare and recommend the land use ordinances which includes your zoning code, your zoning map, official maps, if you have those, your subdivision code, your development standards, all of the various things that go with that and any amendments that you make to that. That's the other big thing that the Planning Commission is involved with. And we'll talk about some of the details on that, but you're a very key part of that. In fact, your community cannot do some of those things without getting the input of the Planning Commission. So if the Planning Commission didn't have a say in it, your community couldn't do it. So that's kind of a key role for you. And then the third thing that a lot of planning, almost every planning commission does, but it's something that's not mandated in the state code, but is optional, is allowed in the state code, act as an administrative body for land use applications. But you have to be designated by the council to be able to do that. Now, I'll tell you, throughout my career, and I've been a planner I was a planner for about 40 years. That's what chews up most of the time of the planning commissions, is doing that administrative stuff. But when you look at the state code, the mandated stuff in state code is to do the first two things. So that you could say that's the important stuff. This other stuff, there are others that could do it, but that's what, when planning commissions are designated to do that, that's what takes up most of their time. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Where you want to be spending most of your time. And there are actually ways you can design things so that you can actually spend more time doing the planning stuff and the policy level stuff rather than the administrative stuff. But everybody kind of gets hung up on the administrative side of things because that's where the action is, so to speak, where you really get into it with developers and others. Mayor?
Are you aware, I didn't forget, that we're at the process now of doing a new general plan?
Yes,
Okay,
I
interested in that this group know, they'll be very instrumental in helping to develop that. Currently, there's just a group looking at that, and they've done some work, but it's just like a drawing on a paper napkin.
Yep.
Or all they're gonna give to us.
Yep.
This will be the group that will then materialize and finalize those first.
Yeah.
A big job coming up for those first two items.
And that's a really important thing, something that I emphasize a lot because what has happened, what I've seen over my years is, well, we'll talk about this as we get to the general plan. Let me defer that discussion until we get there. We're going to be getting there pretty quick. So there are really two main roles. Those are the two main roles that I outlined there for the Planning Commission, and we put them into two main categories. There's a legislative side of what you do and an administrative side of what you do. Each of those two main activities that the Planning Commission undertakes has its own set of rules and procedures about how you do things. And we'll talk about that so that you kind of understand. We, in one of the main training video presentations that I use, the Land Use 101, we call it, you wear different hats, right? You have the one hat, the legislative hat, and then sometimes in most meetings, you take off that hat and you put on the administrative hat. And you have different processes and different procedures by which you have to operate. And what I've seen over the years, again, is that sometimes people get those roles confused and aren't quite clear as to which one they're working under or what they should be doing under this one. They'll take what they should be doing in this one and do it over here, and vice versa. And you really got to be able to keep them separate because they're different processes, different rules, different outcomes. And so we'll talk about that so that you can have that. So let's start by talking the legislative actions. And these are really kind of the mandated things in the state code that I talked about. These are, now let's see if we can get that. There we go. Okay. The legislative actions that the Planning Commission is involved with are the adoption or the amendment of the general plan. The adoption, whoops. What? Oh, there we go. Okay, I'll just leave it up like this. The adoption or the amendment of the land use ordinances, your zoning code, your subdivision ordinance, your zonings or rezonings of property, the zoning map, and annexations is a legislative action. And then there are some other things like your adoption of the fee schedule, a variety of other kind of some other things that are also legislative, but these are the main ones that you are involved with as a planning commission. Legislative actions, they relate to the adoption of policy and to the rules to implement that policy. So you're really kind of setting things up. You're saying, this is what we think is a good idea. And this is how we ought to go about it. These are the kinds of things that we ought to be requiring. These decisions are more political than they are legal. Sometimes we get hung up on the distinction there, or think that everything you have to follow certain legal requirements. And you do, but the other kind of thing we're going to talk about, those are more legal. This is more political. This is more like on the policy level. If these things ever go to the courts, the courts will generally give broad deference to the decisions that are made here. The courts say, well, look, is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? That's really up to the community. It's not a legal decision. It's a political decision. It's a policy decision to decide that. Really, the only time that the courts will get involved in these kinds of things is if, there's clearly no public benefit, if you didn't follow the rules for going through this legislative process, or if you're trying to do something that's clearly illegal. And what I mean by that is, let's just say you tried to adopt a zone that said no racial minorities are allowed to live in this zone. It's clearly unconstitutional, illegal, not something you can do easily, that's something that the courts would directly likely overturn. But so it's only challenging in that.
Will?
Yes.
Hey, this is Tony. You just touched on something that I've always had a question on. Here a few years ago, we had a home that was in a residential area that someone wanted to buy. And I don't know probably the politically correct way to describe this, but I guess you could have defined it as a bit of a halfway house to bring some troubled youth, into this home. It was standing room only at the planning commission meeting that night. I mean, it was a big brouhaha. Later on, we were told that it was a protected group of people, and that we really could not deny that request if we wanted to, or else, that it would be, we would get in some legal hot water if we did that.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, well, obviously that doesn't give the planning commission or the council a lot of latitude if we're being told by, I guess, what would be a state statute that we have to allow that no matter what.
It's not state, it's actually federal.
Federal.
It's a federal category.
So I guess my question,
disadvantaged, or health and so on, and yeah, for things like that, they fall into a category that's federally protected.
So my question, I guess, and then I'll shut up, Will. So why did we go to the trouble of having a public hearing and going through all of the bloodletting that we did? Because clearly it was something that we would have had to have let happen because of federal law.
It's something that's evolved over time, and this really could be the subject of a whole training thing on its own. But it's something that's evolved over time, where it was a kind of a land use that communities were regulating as normal, but then as legal challenges and rulings and things happened at the federal level, this kind of became a protected category of citizens, which then federal rules and federal laws applied, which meant there's not a lot we can do about it at the local level. But many of our local codes and ordinances already had provisions in there for things like that and how to deal with them, or whether even to allow them. But now those really became moot because they're now a protected category at the federal level. And there are some rules that apply there. And there are some things you can do locally, but they're very limited. And so, but many of us haven't updated our codes and ordinances over time, and we don't understand what's happened over time with some of these things. That's probably why you still went through the hearing and everything, because you still had it in your ordinance, but federal law had moved on, and it was now something that you really couldn't do a whole lot about. And that's where that falls into this category here of something that's clearly illegal, on the basis of some higher level law or statute. In this case, it's a federal one.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. One thing to remember about legislative actions, they are referable. What that means is, if citizens don't like the action that's taken for a legislative decision. There are certain rules that have been applied, but under the state constitution, the citizens have the right to refer legislative actions by their elected officials at the state or local level. What that means is they can go out and collect signatures, get it put on the ballot, and have a vote taken on it. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as well, but this is something that's happening more and more in the land use arena now. I think the citizens have become aware that they can do this. So that's something to keep in mind, but these kinds of actions are referable. Okay. While we're on the legislative, let's just talk. I'm going to go through really quickly because you are going to be going through an update of your general plan. State code also says if you're going to regulate land use, if you're going to do land use administration, land use regulation, you must have a general plan. You have to have a general plan. Each municipality shall prepare and adopt a comprehensive long-range general plan. So that's something you have to do. All communities that are doing it now do have one. Some of them are very out of date and really need to be updated, but it is a requirement in the state code. What's a general plan? I mean, I think you're all pretty much aware of that. It's a policy guide for the development of your community, for the way it grows, the way it looks, what kind of a community is. It's a statement of those visions and goals, what you basically want your community to be. And there are a lot of different things that are involved in that. According to state code, in your general plan, you must have a land use element, talks about land uses in your community, a transportation element, how the transportation is going to work in your community, what your major roads are, so on and so forth. And you must have a moderate income housing plan or element for your community. With the recent emphasis on housing affordability, this has become a real focal point of some things, but that is now required. It was made a definite requirement of the general plan a couple of years ago, so that's required. There are other things you can, and most communities do put in their general plan as well. Some of the things listed there, but those three elements are required to be in your plan. Who prepares the plan? The Planning Commission does. The planning in state code, this is a quote from the state code. Planning Commission shall make and recommend to the legislative body a proposed general plan. The Planning Commission, okay? Not the staff, not the consultant. These folks are helpers, but you, the Planning Commission, are the ones charged with the responsibility to do that general plan. And what I've seen in my years is in being in planning is that a lot of times you would get staff and they'd maybe use consultants and they would do the plan. They'd spend all the time, do all the effort, do all of the work. And then when they were all done with it, they'd bring it to the Planning Commission and they'd say, okay, here's the plan, it's done, adopt it or recommend it on. And the Planning Commission had very little role in it. That's not right. That's not the right way to do it because you are representatives of the community. You live in the community, you're part of the community, and the state code says you are the body that is to prepare and recommend on the general plan. And so these others, the staff, the consultants, there to help you do your general plan. Question?
So how do,
So say like on the general plan, something comes up, the folks that are preparing it, seems like that they're on the right track, but how do we stop just spinning our wheels when there is like something like is a disagreement on something, or we would like to change it, look at the general plan that's been proposed and we say, you know what, we don't really agree with that. The size of those lots, size of those homes, the direction it's going, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But how do we stop just spinning?
No, I mean, it's essentially a political process, right?
Yeah.
You count votes of the Planning Commission members. How many of the Planning Commission members agree with that? And then, you know, at some point you take a vote and say, you know, this is how many Planning Commission members want to see that. This is how many don't. Well, okay, we have more votes on this side. That's how we'll go forward with the general plan. So it really is a political process, very much so. At some point, you know, I mean, it's nice to get everybody all together and all agreeing. And on many things you do, but sometimes there's some disagreement. And at some point, you may just have to flat out take a vote.
So for instance, they propose give us the plot of the city. And I guess my question is different. We see what they proposed for us, and we've had some input on it. And there's a section in there that we just like, we get together and like, that's not really what we had really in mind.
Uh-huh.
And this is just maybe me. It just seemed like that process from that point to the next step seems like sometimes we just are going and going and going.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, at some point, I guess you have to get agreement amongst yourselves as a planning commission that you want to recommend, because you're actually recommending the plan to the council. You have to come to some decision and say, I think we want to change or recommend a change to this part of the plan. And again, it's, you may have to have some discussions as a planning commission and say, anybody else have a problem with this? How many of you have a problem with it? How many of you think we ought to change this? Then let's go ahead. Let's recommend a change. And go through the process and then send it on up to the council and see what they do with it.
Can the council change that recommendation?
Absolutely. Yep. We'll talk about that. But when you're doing your general plan, involve the citizens. You want a plan that's going to be generally accepted in your community. And as you're developing that plan, involve your citizens, give them every opportunity. It's hard. I'll tell you that right now. You have meetings, you have open houses, now we do a lot of stuff online, and you try to get, you would hope everybody in the community would get involved. But, I think when we were doing our general plan update in Kaysville just recently, we got through online participation and open houses and things that we think we got about 4,000 people to look at it. Not all of them made comments, but we had about 4,000 people that at least took a look at it. And maybe some of them had some comments and so on. Out of a city that has 35,000 people, right? Well, and everybody said, that's pretty good. And it is, but you wish more people would get involved, but try to do what you can to get the community involved in as you develop that general plan, because it's going to be the plan for the community. And something that hopefully that they will support as you move forward in doing the development. And then, of course, once the planning commission comes up with their recommendation, the next step is it goes on to the council, and the council is the body that actually adopts the plan. Your elected officials. The planning commission's role is to recommend, the council's role is to adopt. The council can make any revisions, and they can adopt or reject the proposed plan or any parts of it. That's their prerogative. But I will say this, the council can't do any of that on their own. The council can't adopt a plan, can't change a plan, can't make any amendments to the plan without getting a recommendation from the planning commission first. That is required by state code. So if somebody on the council says, I really think that we ought to change this part of the plan, and they schedule it on a city council meeting and they bring it up and they take a vote. The first question's got to be, did you get a recommendation from the planning commission about that? And if they didn't, it's not valid. State code requires that there has to be a recommendation from the planning commission for any adoption or amendment to the general plan. Okay, so you have some power there, a little bit of power. Yes.
Is that true for land use ordinances and other legislative issues that
It
all
is.
needs to come through this body first?
Yes, they do. That's correct. Any changes to your land use ordinances, right? And zonings or rezonings also must come through the planning commission first and get a recommendation. The council doesn't need to adopt the recommendation, but they can't do anything until and unless they get a recommendation from the planning commission. You guys are supposed to be the folks that are spending your time and effort on this. The council, they've got budget, they've got police, they've got all the various things they have to deal with. You guys spend all your time on land use. And so that's, I think the idea behind it is you guys are the experts, so to speak, and give the recommendations to the council, and the council needs to consider that recommendation before they take an action. So something to be aware of. Okay, once you've done your plan, once you have your plan in place, then you start putting in place the rules to make it happen. That's your zoning ordinance, subdivision code, the zoning map, all the various land use regulations that go with that. And again, the development and adoption of those follows the same process as for the general plan. So you make the recommendations, and the council then considers whether to adopt those or not. And again, as we just mentioned, the council also cannot make any changes to those without getting a recommendation from the planning commission. Okay, just be aware of that. All right, and just to emphasize it again, for these types of items, for these legislative items, the planning commission recommends the elected officials make the final decision about adoption. Okay, just something to keep that in mind. All right. All right, let's talk about the administrative actions. These are like I say, these are the kinds of things that planning commissions seem to spend most of their time on. These are things like the issuance of building permits. Now, generally, the planning commission doesn't deal with that directly. They may have some role in it in some parts of it, but generally that's not done by the planning commission. But we'll talk about how that process works. But it's also things like site plan reviews, conditional use permits, subdivision plats, approval of subdivision plats, any land use application, any application that comes to the city under your rules that have been adopted, your zoning ordinance, your subdivision code, your land use regulations in general. Those are administrative actions that fall under this category and have the rules apply to that. Now, administrative actions, these are, like we just mentioned, items that are considered under the rules that you've already established. So you've gone through that process of adopting the plan, adopting your ordinances, and now this is something coming forward to be considered under those rules and to see if it complies with those rules that you put in place. These decisions are more legal and technical, not political. Now you're looking at, does it comply with the rules that we put in place? You're not, at this point, you're not saying, is this a good idea or not? You did that before. Now you're saying, does it comply with the rules that we have in place? These, if they go to the courts, there are strict standards of review for these things. There must be substantial evidence for the action that you've taken. The courts get more strict about this. They don't give you the broad discretion that they would under a legislative decision. Is that a good idea or not? Yeah, well, that's really up to the local elected officials and the officials in the community. It's not up to the judge. In this case, the judge may take a look at, if it goes to that point, the judge may take a look at it and say, did you follow the rules? Did they comply with the rules that you had in place, and did you make an appropriate decision based on the evidence that was in front of you? And so it's much more strict, much more technical and legal in that regard. No public clamor. I use that term because it's came out of a court case decided a number of years ago in the state of Utah for, as was mentioned before, for one of these administrative homes, like a halfway house. The rules were complied with, but the city turned it down. The council turned it down because most of the people in the meeting didn't want it. And the court said that's public clamor, that's not evidence, and you can't make administrative kinds of decisions on that basis. You have to look at the rules that are in place and whether it applies or not. If these things are subject to an appeal, not to a referendum, these cannot be put on a ballot for a vote. They're subject to an appeals process and eventually winding up in the courts, if that's the case, that it goes that far. So it's a different process. It's different standards of review, and it's a different process that it goes through because it's a different set of standards that you have to apply to these. All right. What the state code says for administrative decisions is that the administrative decisions have to be made by a land use authority. That's the term that the state code uses. That land use authority is designated by the council. They have to get a recommendation first from the planning commission again as to who or what should be the land use authority. And it can be different for different parts of your ordinances or codes, depending on what it is. But the land use authority can be a body, and it's more often than not, it's the planning commission. It can be an individual. It can be someone on the city staff that's designated to be like the zoning administrator or the building inspector or the zoning administrator, something like that, to make those decisions. So you can designate that person as a zoning land use authority for reviewing the requirements for a building permit. Doesn't meet the requirements of the zoning code. For a conditional use permit, you can say, well, we want the planning commission to be the land use authority. And that's what most communities do. Those are the two main ones. There are other things that have been done. Another one that does crop up occasionally is that sometimes the elected officials, the council, is designated as land use authority for certain things. There are still communities, there are a number of communities out there that still have the final decision on conditional use permits or on subdivision plats that are made by the council. Most legal professionals will tell you that's not a good idea to have the elected officials serve as a land use authority. And the reason is this: your councils are elected officials. They are very much in the political process. They're used to that political process. These administrative decisions are not political. They're administrative. And the council sometimes has a hard time taking off that political hat and putting on the administrative hat. And so you find more frequently that you get decisions that can be challenged on the basis that the rules weren't followed. It was made on the basis of political considerations rather than administrative considerations. So that's why generally we don't recommend that the elected officials, the elected body, serve as a land use authority. But it has to be designated according to the state code, and planning commissions are. All right. That's the basic outline of how land use works in the state of Utah. So let's go through now a process. Let's say somebody's ready to come in and apply for a permit to do a project in your community. All right. First thing that someone who wants to do a project in your community should do is take a look at your code. See if what they want to do on the property they want to do it is allowed for in your zoning ordinance, in your code. In the zoning, is it in place? Is it allowed for? If it is, great. Then they move forward in the process. If it isn't, they have some options. One is to try to get the code changed, like a rezone or something like that. But generally, that's the first step. If it isn't allowed for, what we generally recommend is, well, go take a look at the master plan for the community and see if what you want to do is something that they contemplate, that they would allow for, and where. And see if that's something that you can fit into. If not, then maybe you need to try to go to the officials in the community and try to convince them that they should change their plan to allow for it. That's kind of that legislative process once again. But that's the really kind of the first steps in looking at doing some kind of a project. As we talked about plans, what they are, I think you're all pretty well familiar with them. Plans in communities are not all the same. Some get very specific to the point of even having almost like a future zoning map or a future land use map. That's fine, but a lot of times you find that really kind of ties your hands because you think, well, but that might have been a good idea because it's so close. Other plans are a little bit more general, set out some general policies and so on, which allows for some flexibility there, or to consider some other issues that you maybe hadn't thought about before. But anyway, just something to take a look at in those plans. Now, what a lot of people ask is, well, if it's in the plan, then the community has to do it, right? They have to follow their plan. Or if it's not in the plan, then they can't do it. And many people think that's the case. In the state of Utah, it is not the case. So the state code requires that you have a general plan. Planners will tell you ought to have a plan. But under Utah state code and under the way land use works in the state of Utah, I hate to say this as a planner, but you don't have to follow your plan. Plans, Utah, and there are several other states that have the same similar type of provision. Plans are advisory. They're something to help guide your land use decisions, but they're not mandatory. It's not required under the terms of your plan. So you could, let's say you have an area in your plan that says this should be residential, and somebody comes in and proposes a commercial use in there. And, you know, citizens and others will come in and say, well, but your plan doesn't allow for that. Your plan says this is to be residential. And the answer to that is, that's nice, but plans are advisory only, and that the community doesn't have to follow it. Now, it's really up to the community. Some communities follow their plans very strictly, and they will not make a change to allow for something to happen unless it's also changed in the plan. So they'll go through a process first of seeing if they'll amend the plan to allow for it. But you're not required to under the state code. So just that you're aware of that. Question?
So that's something I was going to ask about, because anytime that's come up since I've been involved, we've made a change to the general plan first, recommended that to the city council, and then the zone. And you're saying that could be just a city preference, but it's not the law. We could approve a zoning change even if it's not consistent with the general plan.
Yes. Now, as a planner, and just as a, logical person, I'll tell you, it'd be a good idea to stay consistent with your plan. Else, why else did you do it? What's the point of it? And if you're not going to follow it. But, you'll find that especially a plan that's maybe several years out of date, circumstances change and so on, but then go through the process and change your plan. And, take a look at it that way. That's what I'll tell you as a planner. That's what I think makes sense to do it that way, but under the law, it's not required. Okay, just so that you're aware of that, especially if somebody comes in and tells you that, and then you'll understand when they're saying that. So again, then when you follow that, you again take a look at your code or ordinance, and let's say under your code or ordinance, let me just have a quick look at my notes here. Okay. It's in your land use codes where the rubber really meets the road. That's what you have to follow. You have to follow your ordinances and codes, your zoning ordinance, your subdivision regulations, the standards and rules that you've adopted. So that's the thing that's really important. So again, for any kind of a development proposal that may come in, there we go. The most common legislative processes that an applicant may get involved with is amending the plan, doing a rezone, or changing the code. Because the code may allow for them to do something that they want to do, but maybe not in the way that they want to do it. Your parking requirements may be more or less than what they really need or want, or your yard provisions or your height provisions or something in there. If they say, well, I can do this, but I really need to have more height to the building or something, then they can also try to make an amendment to your code to allow for that. And that kicks right back into that legislative process, which is something that's not that unusual. So the process that an applicant has to follow in doing any kind of an administrative, or I'm sorry, in a legislative action is they go to the Planning Commission first. As we already talked about, you're aware of that. Planning Commission has to make recommendations on this. One thing I didn't mention yet, but in the state code, when the Planning Commission is considering an amendment to the plan, an amendment to your code, rezones, any kind of those legislative actions, you are required by state code to have a public hearing on that. Planning Commission must have a public hearing on that before they make their recommendation. And then it moves on to the council, and the council decides. The council is not required to have a public hearing. Kind of interesting. Most do, but under state code, they're not required to. But the Planning Commission is required to have a public hearing before they make a recommendation on one of those legislative actions. Okay, just something to be aware of. And there's a whole nother presentation I've got on public meetings, and it's something we can talk about. What's the difference between a public meeting and a public hearing, and what rules apply and how all those work. But it's just something that you need to be aware of, that you have to have that public hearing. And again, just to be aware that these kinds of actions can be subject to a referendum. People going out and collecting those signatures, trying to get it on the ballot. if they don't like your decision. There are certain rules that the legislature has put in place about how many signatures you have to collect, in what time frame, where you have to get them from, and so on and so forth before you can do that. But the Utah State Constitution guarantees the right of the citizens to do this. So they do have the ability to do this. I will tell you that it's becoming more and more prevalent in land use issues. I'd say 10, 15 years ago, I mean, there were occasionally you'd see a referendum on some kind of a land use issue, but not very many. They're becoming more and more common all the time now. I think citizens have figured out that they can do this, and referendums, even if they don't succeed, can oftentimes kill a project because they take so much time. And to developers, time is money. And so it can become something that's really problematic. The election we just had, what, a week ago now, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago now, there was a referendum on the ballot in the city of Providence on a land use issue. There was a development that had begun. It had some higher density development, some townhouses and things. They had another phase of that development that had already been looked at by the council and that they were ready to move forward on, the developer, but the property hadn't been annexed into the city yet. So the Planning Commission made the recommendation, the city council approved that property be annexed into the city in the next phase of the development, go forward on that. And the citizens did a referendum on it and they won. They succeeded in the election on November 2nd, 2 weeks ago, which kind of puts the whole thing on hold for them. These can be really problematic. Saratoga Springs several years ago, when that city first started developing and was incorporated, and one of the first big developments that they had there was a whole big area that was planned around a golf course with various homes and so on. When the developer started the project, he built the single family homes first. But there was an area that he had designated, had in the plans for some townhouses and higher density housing. But that's not the area he developed first. He developed the homes first. That became critical because later, and they had a development agreement with the community. We'll talk about development agreements as well. When it came time for the developer now wanted to build those townhouses, the first thing he had to do was get a rezone for that property because it wasn't zoned for the townhouses. The council said, well, yeah, and the planning commission said, we've already agreed to this. We have a development agreement in place and everything. So yes, we approved the rezone. Citizens did a referendum on it and they succeeded. So the rezone was nullified, but the developer and the city had a development agreement in place. So guess what had to happen under those provisions? The city had to compensate the developer for the difference in value between doing those townhouses and doing something else, which turned out to be a lot of money. But the citizens didn't want it. And they did a referendum and they succeeded. And so now their community had to wind up paying a lot of money because there was a legal agreement already in place between the city and the developer to allow it to happen. So yeah, interesting stuff.
So it seems like a lot of times we go through, we do an approval or we make a recommendation, the city council approves it. I also work for the city, so I see how quickly those projects start once they get that within days. So how does that referendum start? If someone comes in and do they come in and file something and immediately, oh, hold on. Yeah. You got to stop.
The only way you can really stop a development like that from moving forward is to go to court and get like a stay. Say you can't go forward with this because we have another issue. For a referendum, you don't get that. But what developer is going to take the risk?
So basically they would be gambling to continue on with this project, knowing that this could go to a vote and okay, all right.
Overturn.
Interesting.
So virtually all developers, if a referendum gets filed, they won't go forward with the project. And then because they're paying interest, they're doing, whatever, sometimes it just kills the project because the developer says, I can't wait that long. I can't pay that much money in holding costs and whatever. So it's a big issue. It really is a bigger issue nowadays than I think what a lot of people realize. Okay.
Wolf, this is Ty. Hey,
yes.
Is there a time frame So after a rezone or general plan change, that referendum can take place?
Yeah, there is. In the state code, it does designate that they have to provide the notification that they're going to do a referendum like within 5 days of the decision. Okay, so that decision has to come fairly quickly that they're going to do one. But once they've made that decision, then they have a time period in which they can collect signatures. And I forget what that is. It's like a couple of months or something like that. And then if they collect the signatures in that time period, then it gets scheduled for the next general election, or there's some provisions that have been changed, but for the next election. Well, you know, that election could be a year away. You know, because if you, let's say you get something approved in November, December, and then the citizens decide to do a referendum on it, and they get their signatures collected by say in maybe January, the next election's not till the next November. So you're sitting there for 10 months waiting to see what's going to happen with that referendum. So yeah, I mean, it can be that can be an issue, but it can happen under the laws that are in place.
What about a referendum to something that the state's mandated? So the state
There are rules that apply to a state mandate as well, and kind of follow similar kinds of rules. They're a little bit different, but yeah, and again, they go to the next available election.
So back to the
What's that?
Saratoga Springs issue.
Yeah,
If that developer had built those townhouses or those other things first, it would have been a dead issue.
probably. That was a lesson for developers. You know, for the developers, the lesson was build the harder stuff first. You know, maybe it's not a good idea to wait.
Or if they would have done the rezone right up front.
Yeah, or if they had done the rezone right up front.
It was probably the people who built the regular single homes that were against the high density.
Yeah, yes.
Shot himself in the foot.
Exactly right.
Steve Garcia's raised his hand.
Steve.
The folks in Morgan should be aware of the fact that right now, there's one of those happening right now with that ski resort up at near the mouth of Weaver Canyon.
Yeah, Weaver County.
That's being subject to
Right.
a referendum right now, and Morgan County is still issuing the approvals. So that one's still moving along while they're waiting on the referendum.
That's right. That's a Morgan County decision, right? That was something the county was involved with. Yeah, that's right. I remember reading about that. So, okay. Yes.
I'm sitting here listening to this. Is there something up on the hill that they're going to address this? This could get the way things are going in communities and in the news. This could get like a wildfire. All these little communities get starting, and a group of angry moms get together and decide, hey, we don't want this. This could really get a mess for cities.
This has been batted around in the legislature for several years, and then also in the courts. And what has become clear is that the legislature actually tried to make it harder and harder and harder to do referenda. And what they found was that the courts were slapping them down if they made it practically too difficult, because the justices were saying, this is guaranteed by the state constitution. If you make it so difficult that it in effect doesn't exist anymore, then you violated the state constitution. And so they're saying, unless you change the state constitution, the citizens have a right to do this. You can put some rules in place about how they do it, but be careful. If you go too far on the restrictions in those rules, the courts have basically said, we'll slap it down as being unconstitutional because it restricts the citizens' right that are guaranteed in the Constitution. So kind of interesting. And if you want to see a place that's kind of gone out of control on this stuff, just take a look at California, right? And it's, some people are saying that could happen here. So we're kind of sort of moving that way. All right, we're getting close to 7 o'clock. What I'll do is we'll cover a couple more points, and then we can always do some more at a subsequent meeting. But so you've gone through all the legislative stuff, all the things are in place. Now a person says, all right, I can do what I want to do under the rules that are in place in that community. I'm ready to file an application. And so that application gets filed to do whatever development that it is. that they want to move forward on. So let's see. Get this to work. Come on. Maybe. Try this. Oh, that one. Okay, there we go. All right. What we, of course, tell the applicant is make sure you read carefully the local codes and ordinances and make sure that whatever you're designing complies with the rules that are in place for what you want to do there. One thing to be aware of is that is for vested rights in the state of Utah. What that means is this. If an applicant comes in and applies for an approval of a development of a proposal, under the provisions that exist in the state of Utah, that once they have turned in a complete application, that is, they've turned in an application that addresses all of the things that are required by the code. They've turned in all the information, they've done all the stuff that the code requires that they turn in, paid the fee, then they are now what's called vested. That means they get to move forward with that project under the rules that are in place at the time that application was deemed to be complete. And many communities now, because of this kind of a provision, they have a point in which they actually say, all right, your application is complete. That means that now the rules that were in place on that date, they get to move forward in. You know, you're changing your codes and ordinances, you know, not a lot, but sometimes you do. You tend to change them and so on. In some states, you can change your codes or ordinances, and a project that's in process has to now comply with the new rules. There are even examples that have been cited in some states where a building has been built, and while the developer was building this building and got it up to the level that they wanted, the local community changed their rule and said, instead of 6 stories, we want to only allow 4 stories. And now the developer had to go back and chop off 2 floors off of that building he had already built. That has happened in some states. The state of Utah does not have a rule like that. The rule in the state of Utah is on the date that you've submitted, or an applicant, a developer has submitted a complete application, you're set to go. Whatever rule changes happen, don't matter. They get to go forward under the rules that were in place on the date of that complete application. So just something to be aware of. It's a vested rights rule that exists within the state of Utah. And it's the land use authority now who goes through and reviews those applications and makes sure that all of the provisions are complied with, and takes a look. Says, do you do this? Do we do that? Did they meet this requirement? Do they meet that requirement? As we indicated, the land use authority can be an individual, like somebody who's designated as zoning administrator. It can be a body. Most frequently, that's the planning commission, to take a look at it and review the information that's been submitted and see whether they comply with that information. Sometimes you get that process sometimes is a little bit of a back and forth thing, because you get in there, you know, and as you look at it, you say, well, we don't think you really comply with this part of the rule. And the applicant may say, well, but I think I do. I think this is it. And then you kind of work it out. It's a little bit of a back and forth. No code or ordinance can be written so that it covers every detail. And sometimes there are these disagreements. But as you go back and forth, and what happens most frequently when you have a little bit of a disagreement like this, is it's something that's in your code or ordinance that is a little bit vague, or maybe not as clear as it could be, right? And you can interpret it different ways. And that's where you sometimes get a little bit into this back and forth. Well, yeah, okay, but we think that this is what we want you to do. Something to keep in mind now, this is something that the legislature enacted within the last couple of years. There's what's now called the plain language provision, which is in the state code. And what it basically says is that the land use authority has to apply the plain language of the ordinance. And if the land use regulation doesn't plainly restrict what that applicant wants to do, then the land use authority shall interpret it and apply the land use regulation to favor the land use application. In other words, if it's debatable, you know, this provision could mean this, or it could mean that. The applicant says, I think it means this. You as a land use authority say, well, we think it means this. If it's fairly debatable in there, it isn't real clear that it's one way or the other. This part of the code now says you have to favor the applicant. You have to favor what the applicant wants to do. And this is based on a court case from 1995, where there was a provision where you had this kind of a disagreement that happened. And what the court said was this. They said, property rights are tantamount. They're really an important right and they should reign. But communities do have the right to regulate land use as long as there's a good purpose for it. And so they don't have a problem with the fact that there can be land use regulations, but they're saying because property rights are so tantamount and so important, whatever ordinances you put in place have to be really clear and need to be held to a really strict standard, which is it needs to very clearly say what people can and can't do with their property. And if it isn't clear, you favor the property or the applicant. And so that's a provision to be aware of. If there's some question there or some difference there, if the dispute ever gets to the point where it goes to a court, the courts will use this. And our bodies ought to be using this as well so that we don't wind up going to court over these kinds of things. But you just have to be very clear. And so what that really argues for is that as you're doing your codes and ordinances, make sure they say what you want them to say. Some of my favorite provisions that have been used in codes and ordinances for a long time. And as I say, this court case just came out, happened in 1995, which now is kind of a long time ago, but I've been doing this since long before that. But we used to have provisions in our, and many ordinances still do. They say things like complies with the neighborhood character. What the heck does that mean? How do you interpret that? And so if the applicant says, well, I think what I'm doing complies with the neighborhood character because look, I'm doing this and this and this. And the planning commission say, as the land use authority says, well, we don't think it does because, it doesn't do this and this and this. Well, if somebody, a reasonable person, as they say, or somebody could look at that ordinance and say, oh yeah, I could see where you both have a point. If that's the case, then you're supposed to favor the applicant. Because if you wanted it to mean something different, you should have said so more clearly. So what we tell people now and what we advise and what we do when we're drafting ordinances and codes is make them really clear. Make them say what you want them to say. Don't leave it as being kind of wishy-washy, loosey-goosey out there. The downside of that is, a good thing about it is that sometimes you were able to work with a developer and kind of negotiate things out and say, well, you can do this and we'll do this and kind of work it out. Well, under this kind of a provision, it's pretty much you do it this way. And we can't vary from that because if we leave it more loosey-goosey, then we don't have any say as a community. It's just whatever you decide you want to do. So the communities are now going to make their ordinances and codes much more specific and standardized. So
what green is green.
Exactly. Exactly. You got it. Let me end on this for tonight and just talk about this. Administrative decisions, we frequently have public hearings on this, right? Conditional use permits, subdivision plats sometimes, I don't know, it kind of depends, but we oftentimes have public hearings for those. Under state code, administrative actions are not required to have public hearings. They're not required to. Many of our local codes and ordinances do require it, however. And I think that's basically a holdover from that's the way it's been done since forever. What's the rationale for not having a public hearing for an administrative decision? Well, think about the public hearings that you've had. What do the citizens come in and tell you? They generally tell you, I like it, I don't like it. Nah, they never tell you they like it, right? They usually come in and tell you, we don't like this. We don't like it. We don't like it. We don't think this fits in our neighborhood. We don't want it in our neighborhood. We don't want this and that and that, the other. Well, that's great, except your code or ordinance already says they can do it. And so now at this point, you're just looking to see if they meet the requirements of the code or the ordinance. And so most citizens don't understand that. Many members of planning commissions and city councils don't understand that either. But bottom line is when you're acting as a land use authority and you're reviewing an application and it meets all of the provisions of your ordinance, of your requirements, you are obligated to approve it. You are obligated to approve it because they meet the requirements of your ordinance. If you don't, you're violating your own code or ordinance. And citizens oftentimes for these kinds of public hearings, they come in, they're usually not telling you facts. They're telling you opinion. And yet administrative decisions are to be made on the basis of facts, not opinion. And so sometimes I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by having public hearings on administrative decisions. I don't know that communities can ever really get rid of having public hearings for those kinds of items because I think the citizens expect it. The officials oftentimes think it's, the right of the citizens to do this, but we need to do everything we can to help the citizens to understand that, look, if they meet the requirement of our ordinances, we have to approve it. And just because you think it's not a good idea to have a gas station at this location, our ordinance allows for it as long as they meet all of our rules. And so just for you to come in and say, well, we don't think this is a good place for it, it's too late for that. We have to review this now, and to help citizens to understand that is sometimes a tough thing to do. It's sometimes a tough thing to have members of the body understand that. And that's where we kind of get in trouble sometimes. But if they meet the requirements of your code ordinance, you're obligated. And so what that leads to is it leads to public dissatisfaction, right? Because the citizens are there. They told you what they think about it. You're up there now. The next thing you do is you say, well, I make a motion that we approve this because it meets all the requirements of our ordinance. And the citizens, what do? They're grumbling. They go, those darn guys, they already had their minds made up. They didn't listen to us. Yeah, because they really didn't have any other choice. But the citizens don't understand or aren't aware of that. That's an issue. So that's something to think a little bit about how to handle or what to do with regard to public hearings for administrative items. All right, with that, I got to end because I got to get going. But we have a bunch of other things that we can cover in subsequent meetings. We'll get to a number of things. This no decisions by public clamor gets to that whole public hearing thing. And then we'll talk about the appeal process and who can do the appeals, go into the courts, and then the various other things like design standards, exactions, development agreements, bonding, and so on, which are some other things, but we can cover those things in a subsequent meeting. Any questions, any comments that y'all have?
Fantastic. Thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, with that, we will adjourn for the night.